Hi, I'm Adel Najdowski. Thank you for joining me today for our webinar about linking assessment to curriculum. We'll be discussing how to design comprehensive and individualized curriculum programs for children with autism. And before I begin, I'd like to just go over a couple housekeeping things here. If any of you today who are attending are doing this for continuing education units, please make sure that you are logged into the Adobe Connect software. You should have been emailed that link, and throughout the presentation we will be taking roll to ensure that you are here. We will go ahead and get started now. The purpose or the objectives of today's presentation will be first to go over the purpose and importance of assessment. Then we'll talk about considerations when selecting assessment tools. I'll also do a quick review of assessments that are out there existing for this purpose. I'll also go over the process for linking assessment results to curriculum, and we'll also review a few commercially available curricula, and then we'll conclude with some final discussion points. So there was an article that came out by Hayward and colleagues in 2009, and in this article they talked about common features of effective early intensive behavioral intervention programs, and there were 4 key considerations. The first was that intervention should be intensive. The second was that intervention should be based on behavior analytic principles of learning. The third was that the intervention should be supervised by qualified, experienced individuals. And the fourth item, which is our key item for today's presentation, is that curriculum should be individualized and comprehensive. So in today's presentation, we'll be focusing on this fourth feature. Now, the process for designing curriculum is basically 3 steps. First, you do an assessment of the child to figure out what their needs are. You interpret the results of that assessment, and then based on that interpretation, you match lessons to suit the child's needs. Given this quick little outline here, one might think, wow, this process is quite simple. But you'll see as we go along today, I'm not really too sure that that's the case. Let's go over some of the issues that are involved in this process. And assessment is extremely important, as we know, because it identifies what the child knows and what they don't know. So what skills do they have and what deficits do they have? And it allows for one to be individualizing their treatment plan. So we can make sure that what we're putting in their plan is appropriate and necessary for their particular needs. Now, when someone doesn't do an assessment or does it inappropriately, there's some issues that can come about. So one possible issue is you could end up with more or less a cookbook approach, which essentially means you're providing the child with a curriculum based on what a book is saying and following its exact steps without including any information about the child and whether or not it's necessary to follow those steps or what that child's actual needs are. In that case, sometimes you also could end up working on things where the prerequisites are not actually in place. So it's absolutely necessary that we look to see that we're starting with the prerequisites before we jump into some particular areas. It's also possible that you could end up with non-functional skills being targeted. This would be where you're working on things that are not relevant for the child, not going to be useful in their life, and so on and so forth. Or you could even end up with a curriculum that we would call lopsided or unbalanced. So this would mean maybe having a program for the child where a great deal of lessons involved are focusing on academic skills and maybe language skills, but you're not having anything to help the child with their social skills or their play skills or some of those other important areas that should also be addressed. So when we're doing assessment, what do we need to assess? Essentially, it seems logical that an assessment should probably start with early infancy and go up to the child's chronological age. The idea behind this is that we need to assess to figure out what the individual's needs are to get them caught up to their same age peers. So we're going to need to do assessment starting with infancy so we can actually figure out what are the holes and the things that they're missing that they maybe should have developed a long time ago but they don't have in their repertoire, and what can we do to get them to be able to do those skills plus everything else they need to be able to do to kind of fit in with the peers that are of the same age. We also know we want to assess all areas of human functioning, so we don't want to do assessment only on language or only on certain areas and ignore other important areas. Again, because if the point is to get the child caught up to be able to be functioning with their same age peers, we need to cover all of our bases and all areas of human functioning. So if we're going to do assessment across all areas of human functioning, we probably need to be looking at least the 8 areas you see here in these building blocks. I'm going to come back to these building blocks in a little bit, but for the most part, we want to make sure we're assessing social skills, motor skills, language skills, adaptive or daily living skills, play skills, executive functioning skills, which I'll address a little bit more in depth in a bit, cognition skills I'll also go into more in depth, and academic skills. There are a vast number of commercially available assessments to choose from, and you may be at some points wondering which ones should you focus on. Some are more popular and used a lot by people in our field versus others are not, and there's just so much to choose from. So we're going to talk about this a little more in depth as well to hopefully shed some light for you on this area. But I have a question that I wanted to answer in giving this presentation, and I had to ask myself, what do early intensive behavioral intervention providers want from an assessment? And I'm lucky enough that there has already been a paper published on this topic. It was by Gould and colleagues and published in 2011 in RASD. And this particular paper basically outlined key considerations for clinicians that are designing early intensive behavioral intervention programs. The key considerations that they thought should be provided by assessments is that the assessment should be comprehensive in scope, categorized by age, consider function, link to lessons, identify strengths and weaknesses, track progress, provide flexible measurement methods, and be reliable and valid. And I'm going to go through each one of these points now individually in the next few slides. So let's first talk about having an assessment that's comprehensive in scope. The idea here is, I've already said that we need to make sure we're assessing all areas of human functioning, so that means the assessment needs to be able to do this. This will allow for a well-balanced, individualized curriculum program. If we're not going to be able to address all areas, then we're going to end up with a lopsided curriculum for the child. Now, the truth of the matter is there's not a lot of assessments that actually are comprehensive in scope, so it's quite likely that anyone doing assessment who wants to be comprehensive in their scope is going to maybe need to do a battery of assessments if there's no single assessment that can cover all the skill areas or age ranges that are needed. So you've got to look at the individual's age as well and pull together either a battery, or if you can find one assessment that can cover everything given that child's age. So if we're going to talk about scope, that means, again, we're talking about these 8 areas that I've already discussed earlier. What I want to do now is actually spend some time showing you a couple areas that are a little less common in any behaviorally based assessments that exist out there. And this first area is cognition. And I said I was going to go more in depth to explain that because I want it to be noted that it's very important when we're doing assessment that we make sure we're assessing some of these areas that are less common. This first area, cognition, is basically finding out if the child's, or what the child's abilities are to read and interpret other people's mental states or private events. Basically, for the most part, this type of area is looking at what's their perspective taking abilities. So a good assessment is going to include these areas, and it's basically going to identify not only if the child's able to understand and interpret and discuss their own private events and mental states. So how are they thinking and feeling and desires, and what are their preferences and so on. But the child will have to also be able to understand this in other people, which is sometimes referred to as social cognition. So they're going to need to be able to read other people's emotions based on their facial expressions or their intentions and those sorts of things. And an assessment that's good is going to find out if the child's able to do this. So the assessment will need to be able to figure out if the child can identify, for example, another person's sensory perspective. So what can another person see and hear and so on. And that's actually very important because the assessment should also probably identify if the child's able to determine whether another person holds any particular knowledge. So that would go into the knowing area. So for example, someone can be said to understand whether another person knows something if they can explain how they know it. So for example, if you asked a child something like, do they know that their mother just missed a phone call, the child might refer to the mother's sensory perspective in answering that question and say something like, she doesn't know because she couldn't hear the phone ringing and she was outside. All of these sorts of things would need to be assessed. And why is this important? Because it's very relevant for social skills and for application of these particular skills. So we care whether or not the child can identify if another person holds knowledge or not, because it matters for their social skills. So for example, if the child's having a conversation with someone, there's certain things that they will do in conversation, one of which is they'll think about the person's knowledge in the conversation. So if I'm having a conversation with someone, if they don't know anything about the topic that I'm discussing, I'm going to give a lot more background detail and information to get them up to speed, versus if they're very fluent and they know a lot about what I'm talking about, I'm not going to do that. Or if I'm talking to a really young, let's say toddler, I'm not going to talk about something really advanced like electrical engineering with a toddler, because they don't know anything about that. So all of this stuff needs to be assessed so that we can figure out at what need is the child with identifying other people's private events and mental states, so that a comprehensive curriculum can be designed for this. Let's talk about some of these other areas, because I think they're also very important. It would be important to know if the child can identify whether another person holds certain desires. And actually, starting at a very young age, children are able to start to exhibit this skill. Even at the age of 18 months, typically developing children are identifying if someone wants something or not based on their facial expressions when objects are presented. So in one study, for example, the 18-month-old typically developing children were able to identify that an adult wanted a particular object, because when that object was presented to the adult, she smiled and looked very pleased, versus when another object was presented, she grimaced. And so they were able to pick out the one that she would want. Now, being able to identify another person's desires based on their subtle social cues like their body language and facial expressions is pretty basic, but this becomes more important when we're also combining it with a person's emotions. So now we're going to teach the child to identify what a person's emotions will be when a desire is either met or unmet. So for example, if a friend was coming over and they really wanted to play Batman, but we're not going to let them play Batman because we want to play something else, how are they going to feel about that? What are their emotions going to be? So again, you can see how this is so important for social development, and we need to be able to assess to see, is the child able to do these things? We also could do the same kind of thing when it comes to a person's beliefs, and identifying in an assessment whether or not the child can figure out if someone's holding a true or false belief. We talk like this all the time in social behavior. So when we're in a conflict or something, we'll oftentimes say, oh, well, you know, she thinks that, you know, X, Y, and Z happened, but it didn't really happen. So we can kind of identify this person is holding this false belief, and we can realize that that belief could affect their emotions. So for example, like if she thinks that she's getting a bicycle for her birthday, but she's not getting one, she has a false belief there, how is she going to feel when she finds out that she's not getting the bicycle for her birthday? And all of these things are relevant, again, so that the child can learn how to interact in a socially appropriate way. This is all very relevant as well when we look at the deception area. Children with autism have a difficult time deceiving others. Is that important? Yes, we all deceive each other every single day, a lot more than maybe some of us realize. We keep secrets, we keep surprises, we tell jokes, and we don't give away the punchline until the end of it. We bluff when we're playing games, and we also lie to each other to make each other feel better about things. We call these white lies. So for example, if someone asked me if I liked a gift that they gave me, or I'm not going to necessarily say I don't like it. I might if it's my mother or someone that I'm very close to and they really want to know my honest opinion, but usually I'm going to lie and I'm going to say, yeah, I really like it, even though perhaps I don't at all. So all of these things need to be assessed so that a curriculum that addresses this area can be established for the child. And I don't think this is something you commonly see in an ABA-based curriculum. And that's why I'm spending the time on this slide to really go through it, because I want to make sure that the listeners out there are thinking about this area and thinking, how can I assess this in my children, and how can I help these children to lead better social lives if I implement some of these things. Let's look now at another area that's commonly left out when it comes to assessment and curriculum design for children with autism. This area is executive functioning. And By the way, one of the things I didn't address on the last slide is if I have any BCBAs on the presentation with me today, I am the first person to admit that we are not using behavioral terminology in these last two slides, and I do this on purpose. It's because there's already a huge literature base that exists, mostly by developmental and cognitive psychologists, but they have published lots of research and papers showing that children with autism have deficits in these areas, and they've also published lots of papers showing that typically developing children can do these different things and at what ages they do them, which that type of research is quite useful for figuring out what's age appropriate when we're designing curriculum for children with autism. And as researchers, in my group, we've been doing a lot of research ourselves to show that ABA is possible to be used to treat these deficits in these areas, and we prefer to continue to use the same terminology, this non-behavioral terminology that everyone else is using, so that we can show, look, it's possible for ABA to deal with complex human behavior, because there is actually too much a bit of these myths going around that possibly ABA cannot be used to teach anything other than basic key skills like providing eye contact and following one-step instructions and sitting at a table. And frankly, we know that that's just not true. It's absolutely false, and it's possible to use ABA. So I'm going to continue to use these terms so I can continue to discuss how ABA can be used for these. Let's look at our areas in this section. So executive functions includes like flexibility and whether or not the child is flexible, both in non-social as well as social situations. And I'm going to go to my slide here so I can see my visual of this a little bit better. Okay, there we go. And we also want to make sure that the child is attending and that their attention skills are good. So this area is going to focus on teaching the child to orient to things in their environment that they are not noticing right now, but everyone else is, or to disengage with something that they're kind of perseverating on or being obsessive about, or to be able to shift their attention from one task to another, or to engage in multitasking. This is what we call divided attention. Or even to determine what is salient in the environment that should be attended to versus what is not and can be ignored. Memory skills need to be assessed. This is looking to see, is the child able to recall information, and can they do it across all modalities, and can they do it larger chunks of information that are age appropriate, and so on and so forth. And that's an area that's very important for many reasons. Problem solving is important. This is going to look at whether or not the child can, as a young child, maybe even just ask for help when there's a problem, but as they get older, if they can figure out what the problem is and what are possible solutions to the problem and pick out the best of the options and implement it, and then if it doesn't work, they'll need to actually think of alternative solutions and so on and so forth. And when they're doing social problem solving, they're also going to be needing to use their perspective taking skills, because they have to put themselves in the shoes of the other person that they're in the conflict with. So all of that needs to be assessed. Metacognition is going to look to see, is the child capable of managing themselves? Can they monitor their own behavior and deliver their own rewards, or know when their behavior should be rewarded, and so on? Can they monitor their own emotions and control their emotions? And also meta-memory, looking to see, do they use strategies for remembering things like flashcards, mnemonic devices, or making lists for themselves or whatnot. Planning. This area is huge. Can the child at a young age plan, let's say like a play activity, and figure out what materials are necessary and carry out the plan? And then at an older age, can they figure out long-term goals and then shorter-term goals to reach their plan, and implement it and problem solve and restructure the plan if needed, monitor themselves? All of this stuff is very important, especially with school and any goals that they have for themselves, or even just getting up every day and getting ready on time to get to school without being late and things like that. Inhibition, this is going to look at teaching the child basically to wait for things or to inhibit certain vocal or non-vocal behaviors. All of this stuff is very essential in a curriculum for children with autism, and again, it's not commonly found in any ABA-based assessments or curricula that exists, but I think it's absolutely essential, and I think that this area and the last area that I just went over is what's needed if we want to have a comprehensive scope. Okay, So let's move on to item number 2 from the Gould et al. Paper. It would be great if assessments were categorized by age. This would be helpful because, and if we could get an idea of what exactly are we assessing and when do kids in typical development do these things, and we can kind of think about that as we're doing the assessment. It would be wonderful if it would at least start with infancy, because we know that even if we have a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, they're going to have a lot of skills that maybe even a very young child cannot do. And perhaps they need to be worked on first because they may be prerequisites to other things. We also want to try to get this child caught up to their same age peers and get them ready for school. And, you know, if we start EIBI early, maybe we can get them into kindergarten right on time, but sometimes that's not going to be the case, and so we want to make sure that our assessment is at least probably going up to 2nd grade in order to get them prepared and ready to be able to go to school. And it would also be nice if the items on the assessment were age appropriate, so that we know we were only assessing things going up to the child's chronological age and not beyond their age. We have enough things to work on with the children that we work with. We don't need to be teaching them stuff that goes above what's appropriate for them, especially because it can create them to look kind of different among their peers if they're using some more like adult-like behaviors that they shouldn't be doing yet. And if it can progress by age, that would be awesome too, so that we can see kind of where things would be going with a child when it comes to curriculum design. This next one is that it would be great if the assessment considered function. And Sundberg and Michael have talked about this. The idea here is that you know, the child might use the same behavior in different ways, and determining the behavior function is pretty much as important as what the behavior looks like. And if we're considering that, then both the function and the topography, we can get something a little bit more individualized. And the whole point here is that, for example, when we're looking at assessing language, we don't just want to know if the child can do something receptively and expressively, which is oftentimes the case within assessments, because just because a child can use expressive language, like let's say they can, you know, use the word apple or something like that, it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to do it for all different purposes or functions. So that doesn't mean they're going to be able to use the word apple when they want something and request an apple, or they're going to be able to use the word apple when they see a big one that's, you know, abnormal and point it out and say apple. It also doesn't mean they're going to be able to answer a question like name a fruit and say apple. So you can see how all of those different functions for the word apple need to be trained, and so that also means we need to assess all of those so we can figure out what exactly does need to be trained. Now, the fourth consideration that would be nice in an assessment is that if it could link to lessons, everyone it would be extremely happy, because oftentimes we do assessment, and what do we get from our assessment? We get quotients or scores, or some bar graph that basically shows, look, the child's really weak in this area and doing wonderful in this other area. However, we don't know what to do with that information. Frankly, we have to then figure out, well, what lessons would the child need to be able to take care of this problem? So an assessment that would link directly to lessons would be amazing. And that's something that is now becoming more and more available. Okay, number 5, it would be wonderful if an assessment could identify a child's strengths and weaknesses, which would basically help people to prioritize which targets they want to work on, exactly where maybe they should begin teaching. It could also guide teaching strategies, so we know, like, if a child has a strength with you know, a visual stimuli or something like that, we may use that initially and then do more things visually and then eventually fade out those prompts. That also kind of lends well to learning styles. You know, if, let's say, a child is a sight reader, maybe you're going to use sight reading as a way of getting certain skills across. So there's all these kind of things that might also be helpful, and if an assessment can help to identify that, that would be wonderful as well. It's also great if the assessment could track progress over time. You know, ABA is grounded in ongoing measurement and analysis of treatment effects, and we're becoming more and more expected to be accountable. So this is becoming more and more increasingly important. Now, repeated administration of an assessment will contribute to a comprehensive picture of a change in child's learning. It's better, obviously, if you don't have to keep re-administering it all the time, and that kind of gets into cost effectiveness, time efficiency, and we also need to look at how easy is it to administer this thing, who can do it, that kind of stuff. Is it reliable and valid? All of these are questions that should be looked at when you're choosing the assessment. Flexible measurement methods would be great. A lot of times you'll find an assessment and it tells you exactly how it should be implemented. Sometimes it says direct observation. Sometimes it's literally a verbal report, like through an interview. Sometimes it's a combination. Basically, I would suggest looking at the advantages and disadvantages of what your constraints are in your clinical practice. It's not always possible to do direct observation. Direct observation is the gold standard in behavior analysis, and this is what we know is going to produce the most accurate information. However, this is just something that you have to think about when you're choosing your assessment. How long is it going to take me to do direct observation? Is it possible for this to be flexible to suit whatever my constraints are? And, you know, in some cases, maybe a combination of both is needed. So maybe it would work well to use more of like a questionnaire format when you know for certain the child can do something well enough to where you don't ever want to work on it again. And you can maybe use more of a verbal report for those kind of things. And then when you're thinking, I'm not sure, because the child can do it sometimes but not always, and it's not absolutely where I think I might want it to be. Maybe that's when you start doing direct observation to figure out at what level do you need to come in with teaching. And so that's also a possibility. But I think it's going to be different for each individual who is working with the child. Now, the last consideration was that it'd be great if the assessment was reliable and produced reliable and valid results. So in terms of reliability, does it have test-retest reliability? Meaning that if I am the person doing the assessment and I do it today, and then if I was to do it again, would I still come up with the same results? And if I can't do that, then I don't have test-retest reliability. Or inter-rater reliability, which would be maybe having two people do the assessment on the child, and would they both come up with the same results? And if you can't do that, then we, again, do not have reliability, but now looking at an inter-rater format. So that's just the whole idea as to whether or not the test can produce the same results. Now, validity would be, are the results actually valid and accurate? So are the questions measuring what they're actually intended to measure, and do they produce accurate information? This is stuff that you're not going to see too much with ABA-based assessments. This type of psychometric research is not commonly done on these kinds of assessments, but it will be more common in some other assessments, which you'll see in just a moment. So, in 2011, as I said, Gould and colleagues produced that paper which outlined key considerations in choosing an assessment, but they also reviewed a lot of assessments in that paper. And the assessments that they chose to review included assessments that came from another paper by Luiselli and colleagues from 2001. So in 2001, Luiselli and colleagues did do a similar paper, and they chose ones that were used commonly in treatment centers and had had at least some published data on reliability and validity. Now, when Gould and colleagues did their paper, they took the same assessments that were included in the Luiselli paper, but they also wanted to include a couple of commonly used assessments in EIBA programs that Luiselli did not include, which were the ABLES and the VB MAP. And those were included simply because they are so commonly used in our field. Okay, so I'm not going to have time to go into each of these. I'm just going to let you guys look at these slides at your own leisure. But in the Gould et al. Paper, the assessments that were reviewed included quite a few different speech and language or communication assessments. This is the list here of the ones that got reviewed. It also included a lot of different developmental and educational assessments, some social assessments, as well as motor skill assessments, play assessments, daily living or adaptive assessments, and then academic assessments, as well as intelligence tests. Now, and then, as I said, Gould also included the VB map and the ABLES. And when they did their review, they were looking at the key considerations, so those 8 considerations that I just reviewed, and they were marking off to see if the assessments included all of those things or not. And basically, after having done that, kind of scored them all up, and the conclusions were that the VB map came out the best in terms of addressing the most of the 8 key considerations. This was closely followed by the ABLES. However, the VB map did come out on top. Now, that said, please keep in mind the VB map does not assess all areas. It is mainly a language assessment. And so in order to fill the gaps, what Gould et al. And colleagues concluded is that you might need to do a battery, because you can do the VB map and you can get a really great idea of where the child is with their language skills. And there's some other skill areas in there too. There's about 5 areas or so, but they're not as comprehensive as the language area. So you might also want to include the Vineland for adaptive skills, and there's some social skills in that one, as well as the Brigant's Diagnostic Inventory of Early Development too, which gets into a lot of developmental skills that include motor skills and adaptive skills and social, and there's a kind of a mixed array of things that are assessed in this one. And then also you might want to include the academic area from the Brigant's if you want to get somewhere in there to assess academic skills. So these are some of the additional assessments that were concluded to possibly be helpful in addition to the VB map in order to get as much of that comprehensive scope as you possibly can. However, I should probably point out that no assessments on here really assess the cognition area or the executive functions area that I discussed earlier. So that's problematic, obviously, and that's something that has been further addressed in some other assessments that I'll discuss in a moment. And other general comments about all these assessments as well is that a lot of them focus on differential diagnosis rather than on treatment planning. That's not really the case with the VB map and the ABLES, but when it comes to that huge list, all those slides that I showed you of all those different assessments, a lot of them do not really help with treatment planning so much. Like I said, they mostly provide scores or quotients or something. They're not necessarily fully comprehensive and going to provide that broad scope. In particular, like I said, we're lacking the executive functioning and social cognition areas in these assessments. Employing a battery of tests may absolutely be necessary in order to really get an idea of the child's full level of functioning across all areas, but as you can imagine, this could be extremely time-consuming as well as expensive. Many don't provide enough detail regarding specific skills that you need to teach. It gives you more like a broad range of a child's overall functioning in an entire domain, let's say. Many of the assessments were only relevant to early childhood. That is the case, for example, with the VB map, which is a great assessment, but it goes up to 48 months, and so something obviously is going to be needed once we get beyond that age level. And they're not necessarily designed to measure changes in specific behaviors at all, and they're not linked to a curriculum. So those are some of the overall concerns and comments regarding these assessments that were reviewed. Now, since 2000, I think the paper actually came out in 2011, so that's a typo. But 2 other online assessments have come out. One is the ACE, the Autism Curriculum Encyclopedia, and the other is Skills, the Online Autism Solution. And both of these 2 share several advantages. For example, they're designed for use in EIBA programs, and they do link directly to curricula. They're also much more comprehensive, and each one of them has some skill ages assigned to the skills, and they also go beyond the age of 48 months. So these are new ones that were not reviewed in the Gould paper, but have come out since that paper came out. And so what I'm providing to you here is a chart, and we have the assessments that came out on top from the Gould paper. So that included the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale, the IED is the Brigant's for Early Development, the CIBS is the Brigant's for Academic, and then I have the VB map and the ABLES. But I've also included ACE and Skills because they were not available back when the Gould et al. Paper came out. In green on the left-hand column, I have highlighted all of the assessments that are actually been created specifically for people developing EIBI programs. So you can see the 3 in the middle there that are black are not specifically for this need. So they're a little bit less able to provide very specific information about what targets you'd want to introduce and so on and so forth. Additionally, the VB-MAP and the ABLES are clearly just assessments, whereas the ACE and skills are also curriculum. So they're assessment and curriculum. So it does link directly to assessment. You can see that in terms of reliability and validity, what we've got is anything in red means no, the assessment doesn't provide that component, versus in black it says yes, it does provide the component. And you'll notice that of the green assessments, these are ones specifically for EIBI. The only assessments that are looking at doing the reliability and validity so far are ACE and skills. And skills has been found to have excellent reliability, and there's some preliminary data on validity, and it looks like ACE also has some preliminary data, but we're not sure exactly what the results are at this point. You can also see that most of them are not comprehensive. That's why Gould et al. Concluded you'd probably need to do a battery of assessments. However, ACE and skills are much more comprehensive. And you can see that quite a few of these do provide the ages for the skill. And mainly the ones just in green, which are made specifically for EIBA programs, consider the function, as we talked about earlier, of the language operants that are being taught. And most of them do track progress. Other general considerations when choosing an assessment is look at how long it's going to take to complete it. How much training is required of the person implementing it? How much will it cost? Do you need to do a battery? Just remember these also are some considerations to think about. So now let's talk about linking assessment to curriculum. Once you've chosen your assessment tools and conducted assessment, it's now time to link it directly to curriculum. And there is a book chapter that I authored, which is in press, and this chapter is about this process of linking assessment to curriculum, and it discusses key considerations for designing an effective individualized curriculum program, and you can see them all listed here on this slide, but I'm going to specifically address each of these now in the next slides. So the first thing, one thing to consider is key considerations when you're linking assessment to curriculum is you need to determine skill areas and targets that the child needs. So you just don't want the assessment to give overall scores or quotients. It needs to be more specific than that. So we need to be able to figure out how behind is the child in each developmental area, what are specific skill deficits in each of these areas, and let's look at what are the strengths, the weaknesses, and interests and learning styles in order to optimize learning. So we would need to look at the assessment results and think about all these things as we're beginning to design the child's curriculum. We would also want to look at possible barriers to learning that may exist. So if the child has severe challenging behavior, maybe that will even interfere with addressing teaching skills, and maybe some of those need to be worked on first before you even work on teaching the child any skills. Or maybe the child has like no effective reinforcers. If that's the case, you're going to have a problem with teaching them anything, so that needs to be addressed. Perhaps there's a lack of instructional control that needs to be addressed, or the child has issues with discrimination skills, or deficits in other core learning skills, so they can't imitate anything, or they can't do scanning with their eyes, or they have visual perceptual issues. All of these things might need to be looked at the very start, and then something put in place for the child to be able to be successful before we start really designing a really specific curriculum. Or when we're designing the curriculum, we make sure that we have things in the curriculum to address all these needs. You'll also want to consider the child's level of functioning. So looking at the child's presence or absence of basic skills is a huge consideration when planning areas to target. You should look at the importance of one skill over another. So you might want to focus more on establishing basic functional skills before you're working on less functional skills, for example. Maybe that means you're going to focus on things like teaching the child to communicate basic wants and needs, to follow simple instructions, to engage in basic independent activities, or to do, self-care type things. And those kind of things need to be considered because they're going to depend on the child's level of functioning. You also need to look at the functionality of the skills or the targets that you're teaching. So choose targets that will be useful for the child. Just because typically developing kids are doing them doesn't mean this child will ever need to do them. So look at what environments is the child in. What do they do on a daily basis? Will it even be maintained in the natural environment? There's no point in teaching the child something if there's no opportunity to ever use the skill that you're teaching them, right? So why bother with that? So think about that. And what does the child do on a daily basis? You also want to look at the child's acquisition rate. That means, like, how fast does the child learn things? If it's a child who learns more slowly or struggles to master skills, you might want to consider introducing fewer targets at once, or to concentrate on foundational skills rather than more complex skills. And you're going to need to, it'll kind of play into the type of skills of the areas that you focus on, or you might have to think about how much time am I going to need to establish this skill? Is it going to be worth it? Is it going to take me too long? Maybe I should focus on really more functional things. And looking at particularly how successful will I be at being able to establish this skill. If it's going to take me a really long time, it may not be worth it. You'll also need to look at social validity. So looking at, the immediate versus longer term benefits for the child, talking with the family members and the teacher and whoever's in the child's life to find out what are the things you care about, what are the things you want your child to be able to do, not just kind of coming up in a vacuum what you think the child should be doing. The child's chronological age is going to be important. Typically you're going to teach skills associated with a younger age first and then work upwards. You'll have to keep in mind what is age appropriate for the child. There's no point in going above and beyond the child's age level. So the idea here is get the child caught up, and let's make sure we're teaching things that are relevant for this child and what their same age peers will be doing. Prioritizing prerequisites is another thing. Is you're linking your assessment to curriculum. You might have a bunch of things you want to teach, but ask yourself, what are the prerequisites that are needed for these items? Can I just jump straight into doing this type of skill, or does it require the child to first be able to do these more component skills? And what can I teach right now that might facilitate mastery of other skills later? Complementary skills. When you're linking assessment to curriculum, you might want to try to connect curricular areas. So things that might complement each other where possible. So for example, when developing independent play skills and teaching the child to complete a variety of task completion skills like puzzles or shape sorters, you might also be working on developing fine motor skills needed to effectively manipulate the play items. Or teaching the child to use an activity schedule or to initiate play request activities and things like that. In linking assessment to curriculum, you also need to consider how many hours of treatment you have with the child per week, and how long do you have the child? Do you only have 6 months, or do you have a few years? Because if you have a short amount of time, it's going to completely change what you're going to focus on, because you're going to want to teach the most important things that's going to have the biggest impact on the child's life during that short amount of time. So this will affect how many targets you have, what areas you focus on. It's completely related to funding issues as well. Another thing to consider is who's the treatment provider going to be, who's going to deliver the therapy, and what level of training and supervision will be needed for that person. That person might have different skill sets and expectations or different types of availability. All of this can actually play into what you pick to put into the child's treatment plan for their curriculum. Resources. This is important. What will be needed in order to successfully master skills? And are you going to have the resources needed to be able to ensure generalization and maintenance? So for example, if there's no way to get access to, community locations or something, then it may not be as useful to teach certain skills that are only going to be relevant in the community settings. If we don't have access to a peer, maybe we need to reconsider how we're doing our play curriculum and those sorts of things. Now, after you've considered all of those things, the next step is to start to design the lesson activities. So you're basically designing these lesson activities while you're thinking about all those considerations. And you can do this by either going to commercially available curricula, or you can create your own. And when you are creating your own, some key considerations are to make sure to identify a discriminative stimulus. So that means, like, what will be presented to the child that they need to respond to, so instructions or materials and so on. What's the response requirement of the child? So what do they need to do to understand this and respond appropriately? And what are individual targets that I'm going to teach? So for example, if I'm going to teach the child their colors, then I need to know that I'm going to be teaching red, blue, yellow, or whatever. When you're designing your lessons, you'll also want to make sure that if you're considering function, like we've been talking about throughout the presentation, that your language activities you're teaching by different types of verbal operants, that you're not just teaching receptive and expressive language. Your lessons, as you design them, should also consider the mastery criteria. What does the child need to do to demonstrate that they are proficient in the skill? So is there a certain percentage correct they need to have, or a certain frequency or something like that in a certain length of time? And all of that should be figured out and outlined. You should also make sure as you're doing this that you're programming for maintenance and generalization. You don't want to teach in a vacuum. You don't want to teach a skill that the child can only do under certain conditions. If it's a real skill that they can do, it should be a generalized operant behavior, which means they should be able to do it in the presence of anyone in any location with any new stimuli. If they can't do that, then you're basically teaching rote responding, and that's not what you want. You also want to make sure that whatever you're programming for your lessons will lead to long-term maintenance, so the child should be able to do it for a long, extended period of time, not just right now. So in terms of commercially available curricula, there's a vast number that are available. The content and scope of each varies hugely. There's tons of formats. There's online versions. There's books. The cost varies also very considerably, and they've been made for different audiences and target populations. So what we did in the paper, or the book chapter that I said is in press, is we kind of reviewed, kind of like the Gould and colleagues did with the assessments, we reviewed curricula, and we reviewed, I think, about 20 different curricula, and we asked ourselves in this process, what do EIBI providers care about? So we looked at asking ourselves these particular questions, like what developmental areas are being addressed? And we wanted to have comprehensive scope, so we're trying to make sure that we're addressing all of the areas. What is the age range of the curriculum? Does it provide prerequisites? Are the activities linked to an assessment? Are the skills broken into teaching levels? We thought levels would be helpful because it can help people to prioritize in what order they're going to be teaching and so forth. Does it take a functional approach, as we've been talking about throughout the presentation? Does it provide lesson plans? Or is it just a list of ideas? Does it track progress? So these are the things we think that clinicians would probably care about when they're choosing a commercially available curriculum. And so the 20 curricula that we reviewed, you can now see on this slide, and I have a chart here as well. I think I had to fit it on 2 different slides, and the chart, basically what you'll see on the left side is what domains were addressed, so the 8 areas: language, social, adaptive, academic, etc. And you can see for each curriculum there's an X placed there if it addressed that skill area. It also lets you see what ages are addressed in each curriculum, whether or not the curriculum has prerequisites listed, whether or not it links to an assessment, because curricula are great, but it's also great if it links to assessment, just like it's great if you have an assessment that links to a curriculum. If you can have both in one thing, then that's wonderful. Does the curriculum have teaching levels? And does it have the verbal operants, which would be the functional approach to teaching language? And does it have lesson plans or graphs or charts? And so the X's are placed in these, and you'll have to have a look at it yourself, and if you really want to examine each curriculum that we covered. I won't have time to do that today, but I have 2 slides that discuss this, but what I can do is I can provide you with a summary. So basically what we did is we scored all of the curricula based on those things that we thought people would want in a curriculum that they were looking for. And I'm going to tell you now, in alphabetical order, the ones that scored the best. So there were 14 possible points. The ones that scored at least 10 points out of the 14 included ACE, the Autism Curriculum Encyclopedia, the Carolina Curriculum, the Eden Institute Curriculum Series, Rethink Autism's Curriculum, and Skills, the Online Autism Solution. And so those were like the top 5 of the 20 that we reviewed. And the 2 with the highest scores, these ones got 12 plus out of 14, were ACE and skills. And you can have a look at those last 2 charts to figure out for yourself individual information in case there's certain aspects or components that you're looking for. This is another chart, though, where we kind of summarize the top 5. So we talked about the top 5 being ACE, Skills, Carolina Curriculum, Eden, and Rethink Autism. And you can see the first column says areas. So this is how many areas does it address? And this is looking at the comprehensive scope question. So you can kind of see that most of them addressed about 6 areas at least. Also, you can see how many activities they each have. So it ranges considerably, like 380 plus for the Rethink Autism one, up to 3,800 plus for the Skills curriculum. The ages are in the next column, so starting at birth in some cases, or in most cases actually, and going up to for some of them lower young childhood, others going all the way up to adult. All of these were linked to an assessment. They all provided teaching levels. The ACE, Skills, and Rethink addressed verbal operants. They all provide lesson plans, and they all provided graphs and charts. So there's some individual differences. Mainly, I would say that overall, the general comments I would want to discuss with you is that the scores that were provided for all these don't truly represent the differences between the curricula. And the main reason for this is that there was a general lack of comprehensiveness. And this is where I get back on my soapbox and talking to you about the lack of curriculum design and curriculum planning for addressing executive function and social cognition skills. Many of the curricula only covered basic skills, and they did not address higher level complex skills, or if they were addressing some areas, like let's say the social skills area, it wasn't necessarily comprehensive. It was kind of more just like the basic social skills. Few curricula linked to an assessment of the 20 that we reviewed, and overall it's possible that you may have to use a combination of several different curricula to meet your needs, depending on how old is the child or the individual and those kinds of things. So now let me just do a quick recap. In this presentation, we've gone over a lot of information, so I wanted to do this quick recap just to kind of discuss what were the main topics. So we said there's some key considerations in choosing assessments, which you see listed here. There's key steps and considerations when linking your assessment to curriculum, listed here. And there's key considerations when designing your lesson activities, listed here. Now, as an overall conclusion, I would say that designing an early intensive behavioral intervention treatment program can be extremely overwhelming. We know that. There's a lot of things that need to be considered in the process, and we've gone over a lot of them today. Few assessments or curricula have been designed to specifically suit the needs of early intensive behavioral intervention providers. You are going to have to make your best decision on choosing what tools you're going to use in your practice according to your very specific needs, and think critically about the tools that are being offered to you. And we're hoping that today's presentation will help you a bit with making some of those decisions. Now, obviously, you'll know that it's necessary to individualize programs for your particular child that you're working with, regardless of what tools you use. So that's a huge thing to make sure that you're doing. And we obviously also know that no tools are a substitute for an experienced clinician. So all of these things should be considered and taken away from today's presentation. On this slide, I just have the references from the Gould et al. Paper and also from my book chapter on linking assessment to curriculum in case you're interested. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to directly email me if you would like about this presentation, and I have my email address up here. So now we have a few minutes just to answer some questions from the audience, and I see that I've gotten a couple questions here. And the first question is, how did you choose which curriculum you were going to review? That was extremely difficult thing to do. We tried to basically pick ones that we felt were widely used or that we thought would be most useful for individuals who conduct EIBI. That in and of itself is a research question, which I hope someone, maybe one of you guys, might be interested in asking, which is, and this could be a very easy study, which would be to ask the people of our field, what assessments do you use and what curricula do you use? I would love to know the answer to that question. But we tried our best to pick ones we think that are useful or widely used. Okay, the next question is, what do you think about assessing beyond the child's chronological age to find out splinter skills? So that's a really good point. Children with autism do have oftentimes splinter skills, meaning that they might have, some random skills in areas that doesn't necessarily add up the way it would in typical child development, how you just kind of learn things in order. They may be able to do something very high, like, read or do these academic skills, but they can't do something very simple, like follow instructions, let's say. Our suggestion would be to do assessment up to the child's chronological age so that you can get them caught up to their typically developing peers. Now, if there are skills above their chronological age that they can do, that's awesome. And I think that if, in some cases, it might feel nice to like a parent or a teacher or whatever to be able to show, look, the child can do all these great things. However, that I don't think is the main goal of assessment. I think the main goal of assessment is to figure out what the child's needs are. So that's why we don't suggest necessarily going above the age, because think about it, there's so many things to assess already. You could potentially have, especially if you have like an 8-year-old, let's say, you could have thousands of things that this child should be able to do by the age of 8. So why push yourself to continue to assess beyond the age of 8? It's just more work for you, and there's no point in teaching the child anything that's not age appropriate when they have all these other deficits that are needed. So that's the reason why we don't make that suggestion. Another question, are there any assessments that exist out there for dealing specifically with executive function and cognition? And yes, there is an assessment called the Brief, which deals with the executive functions area. And we didn't include it as being one of the top assessments in the Gould et al. Paper simply because it wasn't very good at identifying specific needs for the child, and for the most part the questions were worded as like challenging behavior, like does the child get distracted all the time, or those kinds of things, does the child not attend to stimuli, that kind of stuff. So that's why it was not included. In terms of cognition assessments, that's a very good question. Not really. There are some assessments out there, but for the most part I don't really consider them as much assessments as I do like tasks. And they're like little tasks that are supposed to be measuring some sort of construct that is associated with cognition skills, but it doesn't necessarily assess whether or not the child can use their perspective taking or ability to infer others' private events skills within the natural environment, or whether they do it in a useful manner in a way that makes sense with their social behavior. So the kind of tasks I'm talking about are like little tasks. One's called like the Sally Ann task, which basically is a cartoon, and you just try to see if the child's able to identify if this person in the cartoon holds a true or false belief. A lot of these tasks are like this, where they're literally only testing for one particular skill or construct within the entire realm. An assessment that actually measures that entire repertoire is still needed in our field. The RFT people are probably going to be the ones to come up with an assessment for this area. They are the furthest along right now in developing assessments to look at perspective taking. RFT is relational frame theory, for anyone who's not on this webinar who's familiar with that. And they have written some things, some book chapters and things like that. If you have any questions about that, be sure to contact me and I can try to get you the information. But for the most part, those are the things that are available. So that's a huge area of need as well, is for someone to create a very comprehensive and well done assessment looking at children's abilities to infer other people's mental states, private events, I guess you could say essentially a social cognition assessment. Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I do not have time for any additional questions. I'm sorry if you did ask a question and I didn't have time to get to it, but please do feel free to send us those questions in an email. We can take any questions that you have, and we will make sure to provide you with a written response via email. And today's presentation will also be available on YouTube in the next few days. Again, thank you so much for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day.